So the title of the book is Natural Law and the Anti-Slavery Constitutional Tradition. And it actually the title started out as The Laws of God and Man as the title, and then that was going to be the subtitle. And I think we thought that maybe that misled about what it was about, because a lot of people assumed that the laws of God meant something like divine law or revealed law, something you'd find in Scripture. And what we really had in mind was the natural law. And the natural law is this idea, kind of a perennial tradition in Western philosophy, that there are certain moral principles that people can find out just through reason alone, that they can reason about nature, about the principles, the ends, the purposes of nature, and come to moral principles through that, through the exercise of reason. So one of the statements that we're familiar with that invokes this idea of natural law is the Declaration of Independence. And so when you get at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, the statement that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That idea is that it was based on, as the Declaration said, the laws of nature and nature's God. And so that's really the emphasis on natural law, the idea that there are certain laws, certain moral principles that don't come from government, they don't depend on government, and you can have them even despite of the government at certain points. So the argument, and it's specifically about the Constitution, it's about the arguments involving whether or not the Constitution, written in 1787, was pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And you had this whole group, this tradition in American politics of people who argued that the Constitution was anti-slavery in its essence. And as Frederick Douglass, the famous former slave and abolitionist, said, the Constitution was, in its essence, a glorious liberty document, and that those provisions touching slavery, if they had a relationship to it, they were the mere scaffolding that was necessary to get the construction of the document. And so I go back to some of those arguments, and I go back to Abraham Lincoln and others who maintained that slavery was unjust, that it was unjust because it violated the natural law, that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and life, liberty, and property, as it later turns into in the Constitution, and that that's relevant, that the Declaration is relevant to how we interpret the Constitution. So their argument was always that the Constitution should be interpreted in light of the Declaration of Independence. As Abraham Lincoln said in the metaphor that he used, the Declaration was the apple of gold, and the Constitution was the frame of silver around it. And so he appealed to an old psalm, or rather an old proverb. So in the Proverbs, there's this picture of an apple of gold in this frame of silver, and he says the Constitution is the frame of silver. It's written not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to give it pride of place. And so this was always his argument, that we have to understand the Constitution in light of the Declaration of Independence. So you had various arguments on all different sides about the Constitution. Is it pro-slavery? Is it anti-slavery? And specifically a few different clauses in the Constitution. We're kind of familiar with the 3/5 compromise that counted slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation. You have provisions about the slave trade, about fugitive slaves, and different things in the Constitution. Some people interpreted those provisions as anticipating a time when slavery would no longer exist in the United States. The word slavery doesn't appear in the Constitution. It only refers to slaves as persons. And that was evidence for some that the founders intended this document to exist long after slavery had gone away. And so in Lincoln's words, the founders meant to put slavery on a course toward ultimate extinction. Others looked at the provisions as being obvious compromises with slavery in a way that would offer perverse incentives to maintain slaves and even have more of them, things like the 3/5 compromise. And so you have these competing interpretations about, is it pro-slavery, is it anti-slavery? And the argument I make in the book is that in order to understand the anti-slavery tradition, the people who said the Constitution was anti-slavery, you have to understand the relationship they saw between the Declaration and the Constitution. They said, no, look, the Declaration's central here. You have to understand what it says about natural rights, what it means about natural rights, and that the Constitution is framed in order to make the Declaration a reality. You've had a lot of revisionist accounts recently that have called into question the arguments made by people like Frederick Douglass, like Abraham Lincoln, like John McLean and others, and said that, no, look, you've gotten it wrong. It really was a pro-slavery document. Not only that, but even the ideas in the Declaration themselves are subject to dispute, whether or not these things make sense. When we read something like self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator, there's all sorts of ideas in that phrase alone that people would call into question. G.K. Chesterton, English journalist and cultural critic in the 20th century, said it well, I think, when he said that modern men are much more likely to say something like, we hold these truths to be probable enough for pragmatists, that we were all evolved somehow, endowed by heredity with very unequal wrongs and no equal rights, something like that. And if that's the case, you know, if we really doubt whether or not there's any truth to this idea, that people really are naturally equal, that they have natural rights, that there's such a thing as a law of nature, that we're endowed by our Creator with these rights, if we question those things, then I think we'll question all of it with it. Question whether or not those ideas are true. We'll question whether or not the Constitution was actually framed in light of the Declaration. We'll question what the lessons are to be learned from the history of slavery in America, and all those things are subject to dispute today.